A young boy freezes in shock as he realizes he's kneeling over a maid. His little hands were wrapped tightly around her throat as she struggled to breathe. His mind seems to be struggling to understand what was happening. The maid grunts in pain and the boy is confused about what he was doing there, strangling a maid. Finally, the maid gets enough air, exclaiming to the boy that she couldn't breathe. Snapping back to his senses, the boy flinches before quickly moving to the side of the bed and as far away from her as possible. In his rush to run off, he falls off the bed. When he gets up, rubbing the back of his head, he comes face to face with his chubby reflection. The boy grabs the mirror in a panic, confused who he was seeing, or why he was seeing a different person in the mirror to be exact. The maid he was strangling earlier gets up from the bed, asking the boy, calling him Alphonse, if he was okay. Alphonse whips his head towards her, incredulous at his name. As far as he knew, Alphonse was the name of the worst scumbag character from Dominant Tactics. It was an R18 game he was playing. It seemed like he had reincarnated into the world of the game. It sounded impossible, but it was his reality now, so there was no helping it. He got over that shock way too quickly, not gonna lie. The setting of the game, the Kingdom of Altoria, had an extreme class system. Commoners were forced to be absolutely obedient to nobles. In that world, only nobles could use magic, and magical power was said to be determined by bloodline. The protagonist of the game was a commoner who could wield magic. His name was Zeke Mind. He was notable for being serious, hard-working, and unable to ignore the weak. He was a kind-hearted person. Despite being a commoner, he was enrolled into a magic academy. He was treated poorly, but through effort he rises up, saves the world, and ends up with the heroine. Meanwhile, the character Alphonse was fat and ugly like a pig, and his personality wasn't better. He was arrogant, lazy, malicious, and loved tormenting girls. Instead of learning the noble's duties, he relentlessly bullies commoners. In short, he was the lowest scum imaginable. The player had reincarnated as Alphonse von Valier, son of the Marquis Valier. It was a prestigious lineage of powerful magicians stretching back to ancient times. The original Alphonse especially enjoyed bullying his personal maid Rico using the asphyxiation game. Crazy way to say that you enjoy strangling a certain person for complete funsies, but alright then. Eventually, Alphonse is condemned for all his actions and exiled from the kingdom. Either way, the current Alphonse knew he had to quickly apologize to Rico. Steeling himself for what he was about to do, the young Alphonse turned to his maid and said that the asphyxiation game was over. He bows deeply and says that he would never do anything like that again. To put the final nail in the coffin, he apologizes again for everything up until that point. After that, he orders Rico to leave. The maid is caught by surprise but quickly does what he says. The moment the door clicks shut, Alphonse falls to his knees and slams his fists into the ground. Tears drip into his clenched fists as he starts to sob. He couldn't understand why he had to reincarnate as Trashfonse, or Trash Alphonse, instead of Zeke the protagonist. He sobs for a few more minutes before he picks himself up off the floor, deciding that it wasn't the time to be depressed. He turns back to the large mirror in his room. Observing himself, he figured he was probably around 10 years old at the moment. 5 years from now, Alphonse meets the protagonist at Septerion Magic Academy, gets caught doing something cruel, and is beaten senseless. Alphonse starts to devise a plan to avoid meeting the same fate as the Alphonse in the game. He decides that he simply shouldn't recklessly approach the protagonist or the heroines. Also, he absolutely must never commit the vicious acts Alphonse did in the game. If possible, he also wanted enough strength to survive exile if it came down to it. Dungeon exploration and training might be good. With that, his basic plan was set. However, his eyes find their way to reflection back in the mirror and his expression sours. First things first, starting tomorrow, he was going to begin with physical training. The sky is bright as another day begins. Rico Friere, Alphonse's maid in the Valier household, rolls a food cart down the halls with a sad expression. For her, it was just another day of being bullied by Alphonse. Alphonse had seemed strange last night, but she was sure he was back to normal by now. She opens the door to his room and greets him good morning solemnly, but she doesn't even get to finish her words. She exclaims in fear as she finds Alphonse plastered on the floor in what seemed to be a puddle. From the floor, Alphonse calls out to her, asking for water. Although afraid, Rico quickly goes into action and fetches him a glass of water. Alphonse quickly gulps the whole glass down. When he lowers his cup, he smiles at her and thanks Rico for saving him. He jokes that training was tougher on him than he imagined. Rico quickly gets up, the shock on her face like she just got hit by lightning. She couldn't believe that the Alphonse she was talking to was not only thanking someone but also training of his own accord. Alphonse is confused by her reaction and asks if there was something wrong. She stutters out a no, but Alphonse's attention is locked onto the cart she had brought with her. He tells her that since he's calmed down, he realized he was hungry and asks if she had breakfast. Rico quickly reels herself back in and says that she'd prepare his meal right away. Setting up his breakfast, she tells him to enjoy his feast of omarisha, or Japanese omelette rice to put simply. Alphonse exclaims that it looked delicious. Rico had expected Alphonse to act the way he always did. He would say how he'd eat it if he had to, but she had to feed him. He would even add that Rico should be grateful that he was even opening his mouth. If it were the usual Alphonse, he would act as disgusting as always. As she's busy thinking of what else he would say, she's disrupted from her thoughts when Alphonse claps his hands together and happily begins to eat. Rico stares in shock that he was eating by himself. Alphonse remains innocent to her reactions. Rico is quiet as she rolls the cart back into the halls. After eating, Alphonse wiped his mouth and smiled at her. He compliments the delicious meal and thanks her. She couldn't believe that Alphonse, who was usually extremely picky with his food, had left nothing. It was like someone else had taken over his body. Meanwhile, left on his own, Alphonse began doing stretches in his room. As he flexed his arms, he thought back to the characters of the game. Besides Rico, there was also one other person who was a victim of Alphonse. He wonders if he would be able to meet her. Later on in the day, Rico comes back to Alphonse's room as he's reading. She informs him that it was time for his magic lessons, and a woman named Roselia was waiting in the inner garden. Alphonse thanks her for letting him know and quickly makes his way out the room, already expecting her arrival. As Rico followed close behind him, she couldn't believe that he was still thanking anyone. The original Alphonse's other victim was Roselia von Einburn, tutor of the Valier household. In the original game, due to Alphonse's repeated sexual harassment and abuse, she takes her own life. Damn, things suddenly took a dark turn. You'd think the asphyxiation game was one of the worst. Arriving in the inner garden where Roselia was waiting, Alphonse had decided he wanted to seriously learn magic for his future, so he needed to make things right. In a loud voice, Alphonse calls out to her, making the woman flinch in fear and ask him what was wrong. However, Alphonse does the same thing he did with Rico. He bows deeply to her and apologizes for everything he'd done up until then. He adds that he wanted to study seriously from then on, so he wanted her to teach him. Roselia is flustered, confused by what was happening. Roselia quickly gathers herself back up and says that they should start with the basics of magic. Alphonse excitedly agrees. Time eventually passes and Alphonse is breathing hard, lying flat on his back on the garden floors. Roselia announces the end of their lesson for the day. Exhausted on the floor, Alphonse thinks that focusing for long periods was more tiring than he expected. He was sure he really needed more stamina. He suddenly sits up and calls to Roselia, making her flinch in fear again. Alphonse innocently says that he wanted to read some magic books, but there were too many to choose from. He asks if she could recommend something suited for him right then. Roselia exclaims in disbelief that he wanted to do some self-studying. Later, Roselia follows close behind Alphonse as he carries some books back to his room. They come across a tall man Alphonse refers to as his father. It was the head of the Valier household, Marquis Marc von Valier. Marc asks Alphonse what he planned to do with the stack of books in his hands. Frowning, Marc accuses Alphonse that he was planning on selling them off. Roselia tries to explain that Alphonse was going to use them for self-study, but Marc turns around thinking she was going to slander Alphonse. However, he stops short and realizes with complete disbelief that Alphonse planned on studying on his own. Alphonse couldn't help but think that Roselia had the complete same reaction. Roselia smiles warmly and praises Alphonse for training to his limit, making the boy blush. Roselia adds that since she wanted to take the chance while Alphonse was inspired, she thought he should study while he was still motivated. Marc seems to think about her words for a moment before finally telling Roselia to stay on guard since it was still Alphonse they were talking about. Yeesh, way to talk about your own kid right in front of him. Alphonse almost couldn't believe that his own parents were saying something like that. It was truly the trait of an ultimate villain with nothing redeemable about him. After that, Alphonse started living a routine-filled life. In the morning, he would train physically. In the afternoon, he would have magic practice, and at night he would be reading grimoires. It became his daily life. Eventually, 1 month passed. One night, as he's reading from a book, he decides to try something out for himself. He starts to cast a water attribute 7th tier spell, Slime Creation. It was a bloodline magic usable only by the Valier family. As he continues to concentrate, he decides to add a small adjustment to his spell. The glowing orb swirls with his magic before suddenly exploding in front of him, making him flinch. Clouds of smoke surround him and he waits for it to pass. Suddenly, large eyes look up at him blankly. The slime lets out a sound in greeting to Alphonse. Alphonse pumps his fist up in glee from his success. Happily holding the tiny slime in his hands, he decides to give it a name. Thinking for a bit, although it was simple, Alphonse decided to name it Puggy. Since it's the sound the slime made, Puggy coos at Alphonse again, jumping on his head. He laughs, calling it cute. His smile then turns rather sad as he remembers that Puggy was the first living being in the world to show him affection. Rico and Roselia naturally hated him because of the games the original Alphonse played on them, but even his own parents and other servants hated him too. Alphonse tells Puggy that he's been living earnestly for a month, but he figured trust that was lost didn't come back easily. At the thought, tears make their way up to his eyes, but Puggy immediately distracts him. It presses its body hard on his cheek and Alphonse smiles as the slime tries to comfort him. He thanks it for the thought. He quickly wipes the tears away from his eyes, telling himself that it was no time to cry. Determined, he says that he needed strength, stamina, and magic to survive. Puggy seems to cheer him on as Alphonse says that they should do their best again tomorrow. Meanwhile, in a certain house in a commoner district, another reincarnator blinks his eyes open. He finds himself sitting in front of a desk lined with books, one of them open as if he was in the middle of reading. He looks around at a loss for where he was since he didn't recognize the room. But as he stared longer, he realized that he did recognize the place. It was background number 32, protagonist's room in the family home. It's crazy that he remembers the exact background number. That's like remembering a very specific tree in a forest. He even recognizes the item beside him. It was event item 64, the mirror of memories. Peering into the mirror, he recognized the face too. Steadily getting more and more excited, he looks for a paper on the table with his name on it and finds what he's looking for. He pumps his fists up in victory. His face is flushed red in excitement as he realizes that he's been thrown into a legendary isekai reincarnation. This player was reincarnated as Zeke Mind. Zeke in the game was his all-time super-ultra favorite protagonist from the god-tier R18 game he cleared trillions of times. Dominant tactics. This was his chance to enjoy a rose-colored life of overwhelming victory and steamy romance with the heroines. He thinks of 3 girls in particular. One who seemed to be really close to the protagonist, one who was a little more standoffish, and one that was rather sweet. 2 people reincarnated into opposite personalities would meet 5 years into the future. Rosalia was assigned to tutor Alphonse at the Valier Marquis household. He was a truly terrible student. He never trained magic at all. He was stupid, incompetent, and a little brat. All in all, he was an absolute piece of trash. Damn, the kid's 10 years old. You can chill a little. Since Alphonse had learned absolutely nothing, Rosalia was about to give up and quit. However, she couldn't believe her eyes right now. She watched as the little boy in front of her was doing his utmost to hold his water magic up, counting down the seconds left until he could release it. Finally, the bubbles of water floating mid-air began to wobble in place before falling back into the wooden bucket set aside to catch it. Alphonse collapses to his knees, sweating heavily and breathing hard. He complained that at his current strength, 30 seconds was his limit. Rosalia was frozen in disbelief as she watched him. Not long ago he couldn't do anything at all, but now he was already reaching the level of an adult noble. She's shocked from her thoughts when Alphonse asks how he could make the water orbs float for a longer time. Flustered that she was caught spacing out, Rosalia apologizes and says that there was no way to make the water orbs float longer than they already did. Alphonse is rather surprised by her words. He explains that mana control was the foundation of magic, so he wanted to be able to do it properly. Rosalia reasons that Alphonse was already able to maintain a water orb for 30 seconds. She says that although she wished to teach him more, magic had the power to harm people, so it was forbidden to teach him anything beyond the beginner level until he entered the Magic Academy. Slowly losing confidence, Rosalia asks if she was going to be fired since she couldn't teach him anymore. In a panic, Alphonse reassures her that he wouldn't fire her. He begs her to teach him more magic because he wanted to become stronger under her guidance. Finally cracking, Rosalia decides to make a run for it, saying that what he was asking for was impossible. Alphonse calls out to her, telling her to wait. Watching her go, Alphonse thinks out loud that being hated to that extent really was a shock, but he knew it was only understandable. The original Alphonse had bullied and threatened her relentlessly. Alphonse suddenly notices Rico peeking behind a tree, watching him curiously. With a kind smile, he calls out to her and asks if she needs something. Realizing she'd been discovered, Rico flinches and quickly runs away, apologizing the whole time. Alphonse watches her go as well. He had only spoken to her once and she was already gone. He truly was hated. That left him with nothing to do. So Alphonse decides to head to one place he could head off to. He changed into some makeshift armor which consisted of sturdy clothes, thick mantle leather, and a bag. Coming along with him was his slime companion, Puggy. If he remembered correctly, there should be a dungeon in the nearby forest. He planned on doing a scouting run. With a determined smile, he tells Puggy that they were heading off. Out in town, the streets are busy with activity. Hidden behind a cloak, Alphonse stops as he hears some townspeople talking about a band of thieves. He listens in on their conversation as a woman says that robbery incidents had been increasing in their territory as of late, making the others in her group rather afraid. Alphonse continues walking, deciding to keep in mind the band of thieves in the territory. He eventually reaches the forest. He lowers his hood as he arrives at the gaping mouth of a cave. In dominant tactics, that cave was a C-rank dungeon with shallow floors. It was easy to clear, but it was still Alphonse's first real dungeon exploration. He takes his first steps into the cave and thoughtfully looks up. The area near the entrance was fine, but beyond that it would be better for him to have some kind of light source. Just as he thinks so, he comes across something glowing on the cave floor. He immediately takes out a book and flips through the pages in a hurry. His eyes brighten as he realizes what it was. Meanwhile, night sets out back in the city. Rico walked down the streets alone. Suddenly someone calls out to her, and she turns. It was Rosalia. She asks Rico if Alphonse was at the mansion since she wanted to apologize for suddenly running away in the middle of their afternoon lesson. Rather guiltily, Rico admits that after their lesson she had run away when Alphonse spoke to her. She had panicked, and since then she hadn't seen him at all. The two women go quiet. At the same time, they both confess their observation that Alphonse had changed. In a flurry, Rosalia admits that she thought Alphonse had no magical talent at all, but now he was growing at an abnormal speed. She couldn't believe that he was the same child who only engaged in disgusting harassment. His willingness to train his magic was serious and sincere. With just as much passion, Riko admits that it was the same for her. She says that she had such a hard time that she had reached a point that she wanted to die. But now Alphonse had started to invite her to eat together with him, essentially treating her like an equal without caring about their status differences. Riko eventually admits that even though Alphonse had changed, she couldn't help but remember how he used to be, so she couldn't interact with him properly. Roselia sadly agrees that it was the same for her. Their conversation is cut short when something explodes behind them, making Riko freeze. A group of masked men exit the blown-up wall of a building carrying sacks on their shoulders. The one at the very front mocks the people they stole from, saying that they were completely defenseless and it was a mystery how they even made a living. The group of men catches sight of Riko and Roselia, who were unable to run away in time. The men comment that they had incredible luck to see two beautiful women just like that and immediately decide to take them with them. Riko and Roselia struggle as the men try to drag them away. Suddenly, the man holding Riko down is attacked straight in the face by a familiar-looking slime. At the same time, arrows made of water hit the other men one after another. Roselia turns as she realizes that the precision and mana control of the attacks was familiar to her. Bursting out of nowhere, Alphonse calls out to Riko and Roselia, asking if they are okay. Both women are surprised to see him there. Seeing that Alphonse was only a kid, the thieves prepare to take him out. Roselia overhears their plan and immediately uses her earth magic to capture them. She slams her hands on the ground and the soil comes crawling up the thieves' legs and up their bodies. The thieves panic as they're locked into place. Alphonse praises Roselia for her amazing abilities. However, behind Riko, the thief who had attacked her throws Puggy to the ground. He raises a blade up in the air, ready to strike down at Riko, but Alphonse quickly intervenes. Holding up a fist, he summons out a lance made of water and critically hits the thief. Riko stares at him in wonder as Alphonse checks the stone in his fist. He had used a spirit stone he picked up from the dungeon. It allowed him to cast a spell without needing to chant. With the band of thieves completely subdued by Roselia's magic, she turns to him in complete disbelief. She tries to ask him about the magic he used and Puggy, but Alphonse sweats nervously and awkwardly laughs, trying to come up with an excuse. Their conversation is interrupted when Riko calls out to Alphonse. Seeing his chance of escape, Alphonse turns and jogs up to Riko, asking if she was okay. However, Alphonse is surprised when he gets a soft knock on his head from her fist. She sobs, holding him close. She thanks him for putting himself in danger to protect someone like her. Alphonse stands frozen, rather surprised. Roselia smiles and thanks him as well. Meanwhile, other townsfolk call over the kingdom guards for backup. The next day, when Roselia was summoned to report the incident to Marquis Mark, Roselia and Alphonse nervously looked at each other as they stood before him. Since the rules stated she may only teach him up to beginner-level magic, they decided she was the one who mainly fought. Mark suddenly got up, asking if Alphonse really did help fight off the bandits. Alphonse flinches, stuttering out a yes. Mark places a hand over his head and congratulates him for a job well done. When Mark removes his hand, Alphonse touches the same part of his head before grinning brightly. The band of thieves rumored in town were captured. Security in the town and mansion was increased and public safety was improved. Not only that, but because of the incident, the tension between Alphonse with Riko and Roselia had eased and they were able to become close very quickly. As they were having tea in the garden, Alphonse laughs and asks Roselia to teach him more mana control training since it was exposed that he could already use advanced magic. Roselia happily says that although she might be little help, she would assist him as much as she could. Riko excitedly asks Alphonse to tell her if he needed help with anything too. However, she quickly reprimands him, saying that sneaking out alone was forbidden. Alphonse tries to bargain with her. After all that, 2 years pass. Alphonse turns 12 years old. That meant he only had 3 years left until his enrollment into the Magic Academy. After living a healthy life for 2 years, Alphonse's body had slimmed down nicely. He thinks he's also gotten along pretty well with the people around him. He occasionally has tea with Riko, learns more from Roselia, and even his father had approached him to ask him if there was anything he wanted. Now that he's lost weight and could move his body better, he's been going around checking various parts of the towns in his domain. It was actually pretty fun for him. Alphonse smiles brightly as he looks around the town. Behind him, Riko looks equally as happy. She suddenly comments that the weather was lovely and it was the perfect day for a walk. Alphonse laughs awkwardly and says that he wasn't on a simple walk though. Just as he was about to go out into town, Riko spotted him and basically forced her way into coming along. It's not like he really minded, but still. Eventually, Alphonse and Riko reach a water well pump in the town. Pumping the mechanism a couple of times, Alphonse watches the flowing water carefully with a hand raised, his magic activated at the same time. Riko asks what he was doing and Alphonse tells her that he was checking the water quality, surprising her that he was even able to do that with magic. Alphonse then proceeds to create a slime before leaving it inside the canals. Riko again asks what he just did, and Alphonse explains that he made a slime that cleaned dirty water. Looking up at the bustling town with a soft look on his face, Alphonse tells her that he wanted the people of his domain to live clean, hygienic lives. It would be problematic for them if diseases started spreading. Internally, Alphonse adds that if he did get banished and became an adventurer, he wanted to live in a clean town too. Rico gets teary-eyed at his answer. Touched by his words, Rico hugs him close, saying that he was amazing and it was only expected of him. Meanwhile, Alphonse's face goes completely red as he's pressed to Rico's chest. Their small bantering is disrupted when they hear crying. A small child with fox ears sobs by a fountain. The child was alone and Rico thinks they might be lost. However, the townspeople only look at the child, seemingly refusing to come any closer. Rico looks close to tears again as she pities the child. Alphonse knew that demi-humans were discriminated against in that world, and if they were outsiders on top of that, it was even worse. When Alphonse looks up, he realizes that Rico was pointedly staring at him, making him flinch. Rico stares at him with the best puppy eyes she could muster, and before long Alphonse cracks. With slumped shoulders, he heads to the direction of the child as Rico cheers him on. Alphonse comforts himself by saying that he didn't exactly feel good about just leaving a crying kid alone. When he reaches the child, he awkwardly asks where they came from. But the child ignores him, choosing to continue to sob. Alphonse is at a loss of what to do next. Just then his eyes make their way towards the fountain behind the child and an idea comes to mind. The child looks up as it hears rushing water and finds himself surrounded by floating orbs of water, summoned by Alphonse's magic. The water orbs form small animals, some of which look like small rabbits that go up to the little child in greeting. At the sight of it, the townspeople around them stop and turn to watch. They wonder if it was some kind of street performance using water magic. The townspeople wonder if he was a noble since he could use magic, especially amazed that he was using his abilities for a demi-human outsider. As Alphonse lets the demi-human child see more of his abilities, a girl suddenly arrives. It was Regine Orzin of the Marquis Orzin household being tailed by her maid. She catches sight of the crowd of people by the fountain, noting how it had become awfully noisy in that part of the town. The maid wonders if there was an event going on. Regine flinches as a large pool of water swirls around the area. Rico, the demi-human child, and Regine watch in awe as Alphonse controls the surrounding water with his abilities. Finally ending his little show, he forms a small slime and hands it over to the child as a present. Holding on to it, the child smiles brightly at him. Alphonse is knocked out of his thoughts when the crowd around them bursts into a fit of cheers. His face flushes as he realizes he stood out more than he wanted to. Meanwhile, a demi-human woman runs up to them, calling out to the child. The child greets her as her mother. Waving goodbye to him, the child thanks Alphonse and calls him Big Brother. Alphonse quickly bids the demi-humans goodbye as well and runs up to Rico. Sobbing, Rico tells him that she was moved to tears with how wonderful he was. Alphonse grabs onto her wrist and drags her away from the plaza, saying that they needed to get out of there quickly. Glancing one last time behind him, Alphonse catches sight of some of the townspeople talking to the demi-human child. One of them says that they were happy they found their mother and because of them, the people got to see something nice too. Alphonse smiles. People could enjoy watching the same thing together. He hoped at least that within his domain, discrimination and prejudice would disappear, though for self-defense a certain level of caution was necessary. In the plaza, the people milling around continue to be amazed by Alphonse's showcase of his abilities. They were amazed at the appearance of a water mage, and the things he could do. Regine herself was left in awe at what she saw. Meanwhile, in the training grounds in the Commoner district where the other reincarnator Zeke was currently at, a young man falls to the ground. Zeke kindly smiles at the man, holding out a hand and asking if he was okay. The man laughs, commenting that Zeke had already gotten stronger in no time to the point that he couldn't beat him anymore. Zeke smiles warmly again, but his thoughts betray how fake it is. Internally, he's sure the man can't beat him because he was the reincarnation of the legendary hero Artrius. Later on, as he's walking back home, a voice calls out to him. Turning around, he finds a group of young girls and remembers that they were some of his classmates. Two of the girls tell him that the girl in the middle really liked him and was wondering if he wanted to go out with her. However, Zeke quickly turns her down. The girl who was trying to ask him out hesitantly asks why. With a soft smile, Zeke says that it was because there was already someone he had his heart set on. With that, he turns away and leaves them be. The group of girls are all left in awe as he goes, completely enamored by his words and actions. However, Zeke smirks internally. To him, the girl was just some ordinary commoner who had no chance of dating the reincarnation of a hero. The one he truly wanted to be with was the princess herself, Olivia von Altoria of the kingdom. However, now that he thought about it, it could also be Regine or another girl named Rosaria. Stuffing his hands into his pockets, Zeke is rather pleased with the way he walked away from the group of girls. With that, Alphonse and Zeke only had 3 years left until their enrollment into the Magic Academy. One late night outside the Valier household, a beaten-up Alphonse trudged back into the house. He was completely covered in filth and exhausted. He had taken on a B-rank dungeon, but it turned out to be way tougher than he expected. He ended up being away from home for over a month without telling anyone. He enters through the front door, glad that he finally made it back. But almost immediately, he's thrown outside again from the sheer strength of his father's anger, furiously lecturing him. Alphonse tells the story to Rico with a sad expression. He adds that he was eventually put under a going-out ban for a while. Basically, he got grounded. Rico was equally as angry at him, saying that it was only natural that he was banned. She tells him that a marquise's heir shouldn't be living a survival life in a dungeon for over a month. Alphonse doesn't say it out loud, but he knew that if he said beforehand that he was going to a dungeon, then Rico would have stopped him. Thinking thoughtfully, Alphonse realizes that he really struggled in the B-rank dungeon because his level was too low. His water magic got a lot stronger, his bond with Puggy deepened, and he learned to properly use slime creation. But it seemed like just magic alone wasn't enough for him to make it as an adventurer. Still lost in his thoughts, Alphonse is unaware that Rico was steadily getting angrier as she realized he wasn't listening to her. Meanwhile, in the Marquise's office, Mark lets out a heavy sigh as he comments that Alphonse really was a handful. The woman sitting across from him agrees, saying that just when they thought he finally became a good boy, he suddenly goes missing like the way he just did recently. Suddenly, the butler calls for their attention, saying that he had a suggestion. Intrigued, Mark tells him to continue. The butler tells them about his plan. Later on, back in Alphonse's room, Rico informs him that Regine would be visiting the next day. Alphonse is surprised by the news. Regine Orzin was a marquise's daughter and Alphonse's fiancée. To rebuild their domain's financial base, the Orzin family set their sights on the Valier family, the richest in the kingdom, and are trying to strengthen their ties. In Dominant Tactics' original story, after Alphonse gets beaten up by the protagonist, Regine breaks off her engagement with Alphonse. She then becomes one of the heroines the protagonist could pursue. The Orzin family was related to the current king and part of the royal bloodline, but their previous head mismanaged the territory and lost most of the family fortune. In other words, Alphonse's engagement to Regine was a purely political marriage. Rico pleasantly comments that it's been 2 years since Regine had last visited the Valier household. She was sure that Regine would be very surprised when she meets the current Alphonse. However, Alphonse groans and says that he didn't really want to see her. Rico completely ignores him and says that tomorrow she would make sure that Regine saw the most splendid version of Alphonse. Alphonse half-seriously jokes that he would catch a cold the next day, but Rico completely disagrees with him. Meanwhile, at the Orzin household, Regine lightly pouts to herself as she remembered that she had to meet the scumbag Alphonse after so long again tomorrow. Her expression morphs into one of sadness when she thinks that it was an engagement her parents decided on all by themselves. For her, even if it was for the sake of the family, marrying a gross pig like that was still too much. At every tea party they had, he'd snort through his nose and stare at Regine in such a disgusting way. She tried her best not to look at him, but just his very existence seemed unbearable to her. Leaning over the balcony railing, she wonders if it would be better if she just jumped from there. She knew she'd most likely just sustain some injuries at best, but she would gladly take it if it meant she didn't have to go to the Valier household tomorrow. Her face flushing a bit red, Regine mumbles to herself, wishing that she could marry the water mage instead. The water mage she was interested in was the mysterious and handsome mage everyone talked about in the Valier Marquisate. She only briefly saw his back in the town of Gallion the other day, but to her he had a very refined and charming figure. Suddenly a maid enters her room. Her name was Seria, a maid at the Orzin household, and she informed Regine that she had prepared tea for her. Regine steps back into the room from the balcony and thanks Seria for the tea, commenting that she was just about to ask her for some. Seria blinks, noticing something about Regine. Seeing the blush on her cheeks, Seria asks if Regine had been thinking about the water mage again. Regine quickly turns away, denying her accusation. But Seria laughs and points out Regine's red face. She asks if Regine truly was in love with the water mage. Her words make Regine tackle her with light punches, her face flushing even deeper. As she's having tea, Seria remembers that Regine was supposed to have tea with Alphonse at the Valier estate. Regine complains, asking Seria not to remind her of something so unpleasant. She says that the only thing the water mage had in common with Alphonse was his silver hair. Seria informs Regine that she heard that there was a new sighting of the water mage near the Marquise's house, much to Regine's excitement. Seria suggests that she might be able to get information that brought her closer to the water mage if she went. Reluctant, Regine decides that she had no choice but to go. In her heart, she prays to meet the water mage. Back in the Valier household, Rico bursts into Alphonse's room, happily reminding Alphonse that it was time for his tea party with Regine. However, Alphonse tugs at his coat, visibly uncomfortable. He tells Rico that he didn't really feel like it. He adds that Regine probably hated him anyway, but Rico disagrees. She reassures him that he's become so cool as of late, almost like he was a completely different person, so it would be fine. He wasn't just new on the outside, but the inside too. Internally, Alphonse agrees, especially since he literally was an entirely different person on the inside. Rico smiles pleasantly, reminding him that since he helped the demi-human little girl in the plaza, people had started calling him the water mage. Alphonse is completely struck silent. With that, Rico takes the opportunity to push him out the door to welcome Regine. A carriage eventually rolls up in front of the Valier estate. Regine gracefully steps out of the carriage. Alphonse stands before her looking very nervous. He gives her an awkward smile and stutters out a greeting. It was his first time seeing her face to face. She looked younger than how he knew her in the game, but it was definitely her. Regine blinks in surprise, a red hue coming to her cheeks as she looks at Alphonse. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just a handsome butler who seemed to act awfully familiar with her. Hesitantly, she asks him where Alphonse was. Alphonse is confused for a moment. Finally, he reintroduces himself to her. Regine pauses for a moment, her mind working a mile a minute as she thinks of the old Alphonse she knew and now this handsome boy in front of her. Unable to grasp it fully, she spaces out entirely. They inevitably have a tea party to reset their encounter. Regine awkwardly clears her throat into her handkerchief. She apologizes to Alphonse, saying that he changed so much she didn't even recognize him. Alphonse laughs and says that he got that a lot, so there was no need to worry about it. They go about drinking their tea, the table going quiet. Alphonse glances up at her every now and then, unnerved by the incredible awkward atmosphere. However, he couldn't help but notice the way Regine sipped her tea. It was beautiful and graceful, emphasizing that she really felt like a true noble. Alphonse smiles to himself as he drinks his own cup, reminding himself that he was a noble too. He's distracted from his thoughts when Regine suddenly speaks up. She says that she's heard that he's been training his magic as of late. Alphonse agrees with her, saying that she could call it a part of a noble's refinement. And that was the end of their conversation for the day. A few days later, Rico enters Alphonse's room once more, informing him that Regine had come to visit again today. Alphonse exclaims in disbelief as she had been visiting for 3 days in a row now. He whines that even if they did meet, they barely talked, so he had no idea what she was thinking. Regine seemed to just sit and stare at him like he was some sort of insect. Listening to his complaints, Rico comes to the conclusion that Regine wanted to say something to him but is having a hard time saying what she wanted to. Alphonse wonders if she was planning on breaking off the engagement already. If it was the original Alphonse, Regine most likely would have had no idea what he would do out of complete spite, so Alphonse understood it was hard for her to bring up the idea. Brushing his thoughts away, Alphonse tells Rico that he already had plans that day so he couldn't see her. He wanted to go to the Adventurers Guild to train with a sword. At his words, Rico slumps to the ground face first, making Alphonse panic. She grovels at him, saying that if he learned the sword, the world might end tomorrow. Alphonse is confused, wondering if his words were really that shocking. Rico asks why a sword of all things when he always said that swords were for low-born commoners. In their world, commoners who couldn't use magic naturally ended up fighting with swords. If things followed the original storyline, he would be banished, so he was planning to live as an adventurer. In the adventurer world, strength was everything. It was best if an adventurer could use both a sword and magic. Alphonse smiles at Rico and says that he wants to become even stronger. He wanted to grow strong enough to protect the people of the Valier lands. At his words, Rico immediately gets teary-eyed. Rico says that as of late, Alphonse had become too admirable, that he was starting to feel so distant it was making her lonely. Alphonse is confused by her words, but Rico quickly reassures him and tells him to forget it. Alphonse had noticed that it wasn't just Regine. Even Rico had been acting strangely as of late too. He asked Rico to turn down Regine's tea invitation for him, and he made his way to the Adventurers Guild in Galleon. Upon arriving at the training grounds, Alphonse stood in his sparring gear waiting. Suddenly a voice comes from behind him saying that there was no way a noble could swing a sword. Adventurers whisper loudly behind him, calling him the pig son of Marquis Valier and saying that he was an eyesore. Alphonse pointedly ignored them. His bad reputation seemed to have reached all the way to the guild. When Alphonse had told his father he wanted sword training, he was fiercely opposed to it at first. But after Alphonse explained it to him the same way he did to Rico, he somehow agreed. Mark had clapped his shoulders, sobbing. He said that Alphonse had grown into such a fine young man without his father noticing, making him think that maybe it was time for Alphonse to leave the nest, which is a funny statement considering they grounded him literally just days ago. With proud tears in his eyes, Mark tells Alphonse to leave everything to him and he would get him an amazing master. That's what his father had said, but Alphonse wondered what kind of person his father found. Almost instantly, a pair of footsteps near him, a voice thanking him for waiting. Alphonse's face flushed in disbelief to find that it was Kureha Howell, an S-rank adventurer known as the Sword Saint. In the game, Kureha was a character who joined the protagonist after he entered the academy. So if the storyline went as it was in the game, there was no way Alphonse would ever meet Kureha. Kureha's parents were killed by nobles in the past, so for her, nobles who abused their power were enemies she despised. In other words, Alphonse was exactly the kind of person she would have hated. Kureha asks if he was the heir of Marquis Valier. Kureha says that she had been requested by the guild to teach him swordsmanship, so she hands him a wooden sword and tells him to show her his skills. Kureha suddenly leans close and whispers that since Alphonse was most likely just doing things for fun, she would go easy on him. But Alphonse grips the sword tighter, knowing Kureha was wrong. He really did want to become stronger. He only had 3 years left before the official storyline of the game began. Ever since Kureha's family was killed at the rampaging magic of some incompetent noble when she was just a child, she's loathed the very existence of nobles. To support her little sister Ayla, the only family she had left, she became an adventurer and devoted herself to honing her sword skills. At some point, people started calling her the Sword Saint. All sorts of nobles and knights began gathering around her, waiting to become her disciples. However, everyone gave up right away, saying her training was too strict. so she figured that Alphonse would also give up in a few days. Correja threw Alphonse back down the ground before declaring that that was it for their training for the day. Watching a beaten-up Alphonse struggle to get up from the ground, the adventurers watching their training were full of comments that it looked rough, painful, and harsh. However, despite their words, Alphonse bowed deeply to Correja and thanked her for her instruction, adding that he looked forward to her future lessons. Correja stared blankly at him. Despite saying that, Correja figured that Alphonse was probably planning to never show up again, or at least she thought so. The next day, Alphonse showed back up in the training grounds, bandaged up but still happily greeting her. He asks her to train him again. Correja was struck silent. No matter how many times she knocked him down, Alphonse came every single day and kept swinging his sword. She's heard that Alphonse was some gross pig, a talentless noble, and the disgrace of the Valier family, but the Alphonse in front of her was the complete opposite. His distance control, breathing, core, eyeline, and anticipation gave him the instincts of a first-rate swordsman. One day as they're training, Alphonse lets out a grunt as he thrusts his sword at Correja, narrowly missing her. She's surprised and she smiles at him. She compliments him for his last strike, praising him for a good job. Immediately, his entire face lights up and Alphonse thanks Correja, calling her master. Correja tries to hide her joy at the very memory of his expression, but that only makes her more depressed as she curls up in her room later that night. She was sure that he had the instincts of a first-rate swordsman, but that made her question all the effort she put in until now. At this rate, in a year or half a year of training, Alphonse was sure to surpass her. Correja's face is sad as she realizes that he'll only be calling her master for another half year at most. When that time came, her path and Alphonse's would part ways, but she wanted to see how far he grew. She wonders what she should do if she wanted to stay by his side longer. Time passes at the Valier family estate. Roselia concludes her lesson with Alphonse's. He smiles and thanks her as always, saying he looked forward to their next one. However, Roselia's expression turns serious as she tells him that she would be resigning as his tutor on that very day. Alphonse immediately exclaims in disbelief. Roselia explains that she had nothing more to teach him since he's already far surpassed her abilities. She adds that Marquise Marc had already approved her resignation. Alphonse still couldn't believe it. Roselia continues, saying that once Alphonse arrived at the Magic Academy the following year, he would be able to study magic that matched his level and even more. Alphonse tries to argue that he still wanted to study more with her, but Roselia turns him down, saying that she already made up her mind. Eventually, Alphonse agrees with her decision and says that he'll ask his father to introduce her to a new position. Roselia smiles warmly at him, thanking him for his consideration and calling him a true gentleman. Alphonse returns her warmth. He couldn't believe that the Marquise's son, who used to be called a gross pig by everyone, was now being called a gentleman by a woman. Alphonse had truly done it, which is an odd statement since he's literally praising himself, but we'll take it. Roselia shakes his hand and tells Alphonse that should they meet again someday, they should research magic together then. Alphonse happily agrees. In the original game, Roselia couldn't endure Alphonse's harassment and abuse and ended up taking her own life. For now, Alphonse was glad he managed to change at least one of his ruinous futures. The next day arrives. At the Galian Adventurers Guild training grounds, Correja calls out to Alphonse as he's doing his stretches. With a serious look on her face, she unsheathes a steel sword and asks him to spar with her. Usually she trained Alphonse while holding back, but today she wanted to take it seriously and use a real sword. Alphonse thought that a sparring match with real swords instead of wooden ones was a first for him. Not only that, the expression on Correja's face was different from usual too. Taking out his own steel sword, Alphonse agrees to Correja's conditions. Immediately, Correja comes rushing in. As Alphonse is thinking that he didn't want to lose in a pathetic way at the very least, Correja is instantly in front of him, swinging her sword mercilessly. Alphonse barely had time to block her attack. They exchange a series of blows, both blocking and attacking in equal measure. Suddenly, Correja goes for a thrust aimed at his throat and Alphonse prepares to use his sword to block it. But the slightest movement makes him hesitate and he shifts his position. He twists his sword just in time, realizing that the thrust was a feint and Correja was really aiming for his lower body. His sudden block catches Correja off guard and Alphonse swings his sword, throwing her off. A crowd had gathered around them, watching their spar. The people couldn't see what just happened. Some were in complete disbelief that a scummy noble like Alphonse could keep up with the Ice Princess Knight Correja. Breathing heavily, Correja asks if Alphonse was able to see her sword and Alphonse confirms it. During all their training, Alphonse had been carefully watching Correja. Not just her sword swings, but her breathing, gaze, center of gravity, and the movements of her hands and feet. He burned all of it into his mind, and as he kept doing image training every day, he gradually became able to follow her movements. To keep up with the swift movements of a first-rate knight like Correja, his body naturally got trained as well. Calling forth her magic, Correja says that she would show a fully trained Alphonse her true strength. She summoned her secret technique, an attack called Soaring Spinning Slash. The wind kicked up all around her, enveloping her body. Using the momentum of a jump and the centrifugal force gained by twisting the body, the attack cut straight through the enemy's guard. It was a finisher move. Alphonse was familiar using often against boss enemies in the game. If it landed even once, the fight was over. But things were different in Alphonse's real life. He knew exactly when to counter it. Watching her, he leaps into the air. If Correja's opponent moved behind her in time with the rotation of her body, it was easy to dodge it. Correja blinks in surprise as Alphonse disappeared in front of her and appeared behind her. Alphonse presses his blade to her throat. There's a pause, and Correja admits that it was her complete and utter loss. She turns to him with a bright smile. Correja says that with eyes that could read the opponent's movements along with the move he just pulled, made Alphonse the real deal. She says that if they had been in an actual battle, she would have died. Alphonse tries to disagree, but Correja quickly cuts him off. Lowering her sword, she asks for a request. She wanted to resign as his master. Immediately, Alphonse exclaims in disbelief. Correja says that there was nothing more she could teach him, but Alphonse argues that he was still inexperienced. With tears in his eyes, he tries to tell Correja that he still wanted to learn a lot more from her. First it was Roselia, now he had to say goodbye to Correja too. Correja tries to remain composed, but internally she was losing her composure over Alphonse's cries. She explains that his sword skills already had enough power to surpass hers. From there on out, he just needed to polish his skills through real battles. Alphonse continues to argue that she was still stronger than him and that was why he wanted her to keep being his master. Finally, Correja tells Alphonse that he seemed to have a mental barrier that told him he shouldn't defeat his master. Alphonse is surprised to hear that he was unconsciously holding himself back so he wouldn't win against her. But in their spar just now, she was certain that he was very close to overcoming that barrier, and that was why there was nothing more for her to teach him. Alphonse looked absolutely crestfallen as he tried to come up with something to say, but Correja cuts him off again. She suddenly kneels in front of him and says that she wanted to keep watching his talent with the sword, so she asks that instead of a master she wants to be his knight. Correja was asking for a knight contract, an agreement where a noble hired an adventurer as a knight and that adventurer would swear absolute loyalty to their single lord. Immediately, the crowd around them bursts into exclaims of disbelief. They couldn't believe that Correja would become the knight of a talentless noble like Alphonse, which is a crazy statement considering they just watched him beat her in a fair duel. In the game's original storyline, the one who formed a knight contract with Correja was the protagonist, Zeke. If Alphonse made the contract with Correja now, she wouldn't be able to make the contract with Zeke later on. Again, Correja asks Alphonse to let her be his knight. If Alphonse let Correja be his knight, it would be a huge support when he started working as an adventurer. Not only that, but she was someone who acknowledged his talent with the sword. The storyline would be completely broken, but he couldn't just coldly reject her. Crazy to think he's still worried about the original storyline when he broke it immediately after deciding to start physical training alone. Eventually, Alphonse smiles and agrees to the knight contract, making Correja's face brighten immediately as she thanks him. Holding out a sword and using his magic, it glows as they perform the knight contract. He asks Correja if she swore to take him as his lord for life and pledge her loyalty. Correja readily agrees, and with that, Alphonse takes her as his knight. In the original game, she was a companion of the protagonist, but now that very person was Alphonse's ally. Eventually, more time passes. The day finally arrived for him to enroll at the Septarian Magic Academy. Only a few hours left, and the original game storyline would begin. Standing in front of the Valier estate, a row of maids and butlers say farewell to Alphonse. The head butler bows to Alphonse as he congratulates him for his successful enrollment into the Magic Academy. He says that he, the butlers and maids, sincerely prayed for the continued success of Alphonse, who had grown up splendidly. Alphonse smiles at them warmly and thanks them. The head butler expresses the regret of Alphonse's parents that they were away on official business. They were very disappointed they couldn't be there to see him off. Alphonse reassures him that they already had more than enough time to say their goodbyes, their very tearful farewell still fresh in his mind. Gesturing to a grand set of clothes, the head butler adds that Alphonse's parents were also looking forward to having a uniform made for him that would be worthy of a Valier heir with no shame attached. Smiling awkwardly, Alphonse brushes off his words and says that he was heading out since the carriage was already there. He doesn't tell the head butler that there was no way he was wearing something so grand when he was planning on staying as a background character. However, when he turns around, Alphonse freezes in place at the sight of the carriage, which turned out to be made completely out of gold. It was so grand even the driver seemed to be embarrassed to be driving it. Alphonse comments that it was a total waste of money, internally wondering what his father was thinking to provide him with something like that. The head butler merely clears his throat and delivers a message from the Marquis, which basically just told him that nobles should live in luxury, even if the people grew to hate him because of it. Alphonse frowns in disbelief as he continues to stare at the carriage, still unable to understand what his father was thinking. However, Alphonse knew that if they started looking for another carriage now, he wouldn't make it in time for the entrance ceremony. Suddenly, a lovely girl comes up to Alphonse greeting him good morning. It was Regine, and Alphonse automatically returned her greeting, but he wondered what she was doing there so early in the morning. Regine puffs her cheeks out in anger at his words. She argues that since she was his fiancée, it was only natural for her to go to the academy with him. Alphonse seems doubtful of her reasoning. Growing timid, Regine calls Alphonse awful for not wanting to go with her. Alphonse tries to reassure her that that wasn't his concern, but it was too late. Tearfully angry, Regine yells that she's heard enough. She storms off, telling Alphonse to ride the awful carriage on his own and to pile up all the people's hatred all he likes. Watching her go, Alphonse was convinced that Regine hated him. He makes peace with it quickly since it was how she was set up in the original game. However, Rico leans up to Alphonse with a cheeky smile, commenting that Regine seemed quite fond of him. Alphonse is confused by her words because no matter how he looked at it, she just seemed to hate him. Rico huffs out in exasperation, calling Alphonse too dense because Regine was just the type of person who couldn't be honest about her feelings. Thinking about her words, Alphonse wonders if Regine was a tsundere, but no matter what, he couldn't picture a future where she completely acted that way towards him. Mumbling to herself, Rico says that Regine was a powerful rival since being the official fiancé was the strangest position. She's disrupted from her thoughts when Alphonse asks her if there was something wrong. Rico quickly reassures him that it was nothing and she changes the subject, saying that they should head out or else they'll be late. As the carriage sped down the road, Alphonse thoughtfully looked out the window. He has done everything he can. At the academy, he just needed to stay as far away from the protagonist as possible. He looks up when he hears Rico squeal in glee, showing a screen to Correia that showcases Alphonse's abilities. Correia nods proudly, saying that it was only expected of her lord to show magnificent swordsmanship. Internally, Alphonse envies their ability to be carefree. Rico comments how convenient magic tools were, seeing as someone like her who had no magic power could watch videos. She deadass has a tablet, I guess. Correia says that filming Alphonse without permission was unforgivable, but she was grateful for the video itself. Rico turns to Alphonse, asking why he shouldn't just go ahead and reveal that he was the water mage. Correia agrees with Rico, adding that the world should know more about his talent with the sword. Alphonse calmly reasons that he wanted to focus on his studies at the Magic Academy. Not only that, but he didn't want to stand out and end up buried in guild requests. He doesn't tell them that he also definitely did not want the protagonist's side to even notice that he existed. Rico and Correia praise him for wanting to properly fulfill his duties as a student. Alphonse changes topics and asks if Correia was planning to come to the academy, too. With a proud smile, Correia says that since they formed a night contract, she was to handle everything from guarding him to looking after his daily needs. Rico excitedly exclaims when she sees the royal capital. They eventually enter the royal capital of Granzion. All three of them marvel at its large size and number of people bustling all over the streets. Alphonse remembers that on the original game map it was all divided up roughly. But in reality it was all mixed together. Turning to face his companions, Alphonse asks them what they were suddenly doing. Rico lets him know that they were playing rock, paper, scissors to decide who got to accompany him and who had to carry the luggage to the dorms. Rico comes out on top of the game, making Correia sob from the loss. She couldn't believe that a knight failed to guard her lord, calling it a lifelong disgrace. Rico happily says she'd leave the luggage up to her and Alphonse just calmly bids her goodbye. They eventually reach Septirion Magic Academy. Looking up at the school, Alphonse marvels at the place where the main story of dominant tactics really began. He tried to remember how the storyline went in the game. An elf-like girl had fallen face first into the ground and started to sob loudly. A man stood over her, clicking his tongue and complaining how loud she was crying. The man was Alphonse, and demanding to know why a demi-human was walking around the area, he tried to step on her. Before he can hurt her any further, he goes flying from a swift punch by Zeke. As Alphonse crashes to the ground, Zeke turns to the elf girl and heals her. However, she suddenly panics as she sees Alphonse coming back at Zeke, ready to hit him from behind. Zeke raises his hand and summons a lightning arrow, completely electrocuting Alphonse. As Alphonse lies on the ground, paralyzed, Zeke says that he didn't want to kill trash like him, so he went easy on him. However, Alphonse wouldn't be able to move for a while. The elf girl's mother thanks Zeke profusely for saving her daughter. Suddenly, another female student steps forward, complimenting Zeke for his strength. Zeke asks who the girl was, and she introduces herself as Olivia, someone who had been watching him from a moment ago. That was the first meeting between the protagonist and the heroine. Alphonse notices movement from the corner of his vision and is snapped out of his thoughts. He's surprised to see that it was the protagonist, Zeke Mind. However, he seemed to look rougher than he did in the game art. Alphonse freezes when he starts to hear sobbing. Alphonse realizes the event had started when Zeke kneels down towards an elf girl with a bleeding forehead. Zeke reassures the child that he would heal her. Holding out a hand, Zeke summons his magic. A crowd had formed around them, and amongst the people was a girl, silently watching the exchange. However, Alphonse seemed confused. The healing seemed to be taking longer than he thought. Even if Zeke was the protagonist, at level 1 his healing magic must have still been pretty weak. Watching the event, Rico tells Alphonse that the child looked so pitiful and if it went on the way things were going, she would be left with scars. Alphonse calmly agrees. Doubling down, Rico fully turns to Alphonse and says that if it was him, he would be able to heal her properly. Alphonse agrees again, although much less confidently. He was getting a strange case of déjà vu. The girl in the crowd continues to watch quietly. Finally, Alphonse steps forward. He convinces himself that as long as he doesn't get too involved with Zeke, that impact should be minimal. He would just heal the child and leave quickly. She kneels before the elven girl and ignores Zeke as he asks who he was. Holding out his hand, Alphonse activates his high healing magic. A bright glow overtakes the group, making Zeke gape in shock. From the crowd, the girl is equally in awe. Finally, the glow slowly fades. To erase the wound completely, Alphonse had used High Heal, an advanced spell. It was magic a person could only get once they hit close to level 50. Touching the area where her wound used to be, the elven girl marvels that it didn't hurt at all anymore. She thanks Alfonso. As Alfonso turns to leave, the elven girl's mother tries to pay him for healing her daughter. But Alfonso smiles warmly and says that helping those in need was a noble's duty, so her gratitude was more than enough. Rico praises Alfonso for his work before he says that they should go quickly because he really didn't want to stand out. As Alfonso passes by Zeke, he hears a click of a tongue. He keeps moving, but he glances back at him. He wonders if that was Zeke, but he was sure that that couldn't be right. Rico calls out to him to get him moving again. As the crowd disperses, only the girl from earlier remains. She watches with a thoughtful look on her face as Alphonse disappears into the distance. Somewhere in the school, a fist is roughly slammed on a wall, the person cursing loudly. Zeke crumples to the floor of a bathroom stall, mourning his glorious first event. He didn't know who the man from earlier was. As far as he knew, there was no other character like that. His face had morphed into a terrifying snarl as he tried to keep his emotions in check. Not very main character like, that's for sure. He knew the game inside and out. He should even remember all the background characters who only show up for a second. In the original scenario, he was supposed to beat the crap out of the disgusting fat pig of a villain, Alphonse. And then Olivia talks to him afterwards. However, none of that happened, making Zeke freak out even more. Olivia didn't talk to him. He didn't even meet her. Nervously biting on his nails, Zeke was convinced something was wrong. He was Zeke, and he was supposed to be the protagonist. However, a silver-haired guy had swooped in to save the girl. The guy even looked way more like the protagonist than he did. Zeke continues to have a meltdown in the bathroom stall. He was convinced that he had to take back the rightful world. He was Zeke and he was the protagonist. He wasn't going to let anyone steal that title from him. However, should there be someone who tried to destroy the original story, he was sure that he would just have to kill them. Olivia von Altoria was the second princess of the Kingdom of Altoria. For Olivia, the kingdom was completely rotten. The Kingdom of Altoria was a nation that placed magic above all else, where a person's future was determined by their magical talent. Magic could only be used by nobles, while swords were tools of the commoners. As the people around nobles fawned over them for their high magic power, those same nobles grew more and more arrogant, content to sit comfortably in their high-ranking positions. However, the person Olivia saw by the school entrance was different. He helped an elven girl, a demi-human and one of the most discriminated against in the kingdom. The boy had appeared out of nowhere and without a second thought healed her wounds. That person was exactly the kind of person she needed for her plan. Olivia looks up as someone enters her room. It was her personal maid and knight, Aisha. She was a demi-human, and a loyal member of her plan that would never betray her. Aisha smiles at Olivia and comments that the princess seemed to have found someone promising. Olivia agrees with Aisha, saying that Alphonse was precisely the kind of person she's been looking for. At his age, Alphonse had activated an advanced magic spell without even chanting anything. With that much talent, most people would turn insufferably arrogant. But Alphonse had turned down the silver coins the girl's mother offered as thanks. Olivia smiles as she remembers Alphonse's words. It was a noble's duty to help those in need. He was a true noble, nothing like the arrogant, lazy frauds who infested the kingdom right now. Alphonse had shown true noblesse oblige, the duty of those born into greatness. Olivia needed to recruit him at any cost. Looking out the window, Olivia orders Aisha to look into Alphonse for her. His social circle, his hobbies, and even his love life. Her last request makes Aisha ask again, almost double-checking. A silence passes through the room as Olivia's face goes red. She quickly tries to salvage her dignity, saying that there was no deep meaning behind it, but Aisha smiles pleasantly and teasingly. Olivia continues to defend herself, saying that it wasn't like anything Aisha was thinking. But Aisha laughs again, saying that she was so easy to read. Time passes and the entrance ceremony begins. A group of mages stood before the students in the assembly hall, welcoming them to the Magic Academy. Before the official start of the ceremony, the mages say that they would be measuring everyone's magic power. Their classes would be assigned based on the amount of magic power each student possessed. Listening closely, Alphonse recognizes that the next event would be the magic power measurement. At the Magic Academy, students were divided into classes from A to F based on their magic power, A being the highest and F being the lowest. The amount of magic power a person held was a reflection of their talent as a mage. A person could move up a class if their magic power increases during enrollment, but apparently that almost never happens. It was because magic power was almost entirely determined by bloodline. Suddenly, the crowd parts as a majestically cloaked figure moves towards the front of the room. Alphonse turns around as girls squeal at the arrival of Prince Julius. Julius von Altoria was the first prince of the Kingdom of Altoria, first in line for the throne and blessed with an enormous amount of magic power. A crowd of girls with light sticks and banners made in his name squealed one more time, calling out to him. His talent for magic also apparently ranks among the highest in all of royal history. Watching Julius wave to the onlookers, Alphonse smiles awkwardly. Julius was also one of the characters who was meant to get his comeuppance later. His stats were flawless, but his character was the absolute worst. He saw people as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. Alphonse used to be one of Julius's lackeys. In the original storyline, Alphonse, being the worst kind of noble, had ended up isolated at the academy. Julius reached out a hand and took advantage of that. Furious at Olivia for being close to Zeke, a commoner, despite being royalty herself, he sixed Alphonse on her. He told him that he would give him Olivia and she was his. Julius sent Alphonse to attack Olivia, but it ended in failure when Zeke came to her rescue. In a last-ditch effort to defend himself, Alphonse told them that Prince Julius gave him permission to do whatever he wanted with Olivia. However, hearing his words, Julius claimed he didn't know Alphonse. Without a moment's hesitation, Julius had thrown him away like trash. In the end, near graduation, Julius and Zeke have a duel and he gets beaten to a pulp. In the present day, Alphonse watches as Prince Julius is called on stage. The mage at the front tells him to place his hand on top of the crystal ball. He smiles brightly, making more girls squeal. Alphonse marvels that Julius, being royalty, sure knew how to put on a good face in public. He places his hand on the crystal ball and starts to emit a strong glow. The mage exclaims that Julius's magic power was at 150. Julius smiles, saying that it was only expected. The average magic power was 50, that meant he had 3 times the average. The noble ladies in the audience cry out in pure amazement, calling him a genius. For them, the academy was also a place to find a husband, so they were giving it their all. As he leaves the stage, Julius catches sight of Olivia in the crowd. He smiles at her, making her raise an eyebrow at him suspiciously. Zeke is next called to the stage. As Zeke climbs the steps up to the stage, whispers break out all around him. They're surprised to hear that a commoner was among their ranks. They immediately come to the conclusion that his magic power was basically zero, and even throw in rude comments such as how he was just going to dirty the crystal ball. Zeke places a hand on the crystal ball and it glows at the touch of his magic. The mage exclaims in disbelief to see that Zeke Mine's magic power was at 900. Zeke pumps his fist in the air, trying to look humble, but it's failing. Alphonse remembered that Zeke's magic power was on a completely different level, 18 times the average and 6 times more than Julius. The crowd is in disbelief that a commoner had such a score, especially since it was higher than Julius. The mage at the stage confirms that the reading was correct and Zeke would be placed in Class A. Some of the students tremble in fear as Julius barely restrains his anger to hear that a commoner was going to Class A. As Zeke confidently strides back to the line of students, he listens to the people around him whisper even more. Just like Julius, they couldn't believe a commoner like Zeke was in Class A. They were convinced that it had to be some kind of trick, but they were also sure that he would end up in Class F before long. However, Zeke doesn't let any of their words get to him, and as he passes by Alphonse, he mindlessly and confidently tells himself that he really was the protagonist. His words make Alphonse turn around, rather surprised and confused. Before he can think about it too much, however, his name is called up to the stage. As he climbs the steps, the crowds burst into chatter again, wondering who the handsome guy was. Someone heard before that the Valier hair was nothing but a gross fatso. However, they're surprised that he wasn't a pig at all. Alphonse pretends not to be listening in, but he felt awkward having to hear all the kinds of things they were saying. Since that was how his character was originally written, he knew it couldn't really be helped. Either way, as he reaches the crystal ball, he knew he needed to figure out a way to cover things up. His magic power was currently at least 1,800. Since he's been training magic every single day since he was reincarnated, his magic power has reached a ridiculous level. Alphonse knew that if he let them measure it as is, he would definitely end up in Class A where all the other main characters were. To stay away from the main cast, Alphonse decides to avoid getting into Class A no matter what. He decides to use magic control to make it look lower than how it really is. It was the magic control training he did together with Professor Roselia. By training to manipulate his magic until he literally collapsed for whole days at a time, he learned to precisely control how much magic power he released at will. He's asked to place his hand on the crystal ball and he tells himself to control his magic as the crystal emits a light all over. The mage announces Alphonse's magic power with a total of 50. Alphonse smiles in relief to himself. He was able to hit the average exactly. One of the mages on stage announces that Alphonse would be put in Class C. Alphonse was internally glad it was the class perfectly suited for a mob character like he wanted to be. As he steps out of the stage, the crowd loudly whispers once more. They couldn't believe that someone from a marquise's family only had 50. They call him a loser and a waste of good looks. However, Alphonse walks past them with a content smile. He knew that normally someone from a marquise house rarely scored below an 80, so he really couldn't blame people for mocking a marquise's son with only a 50. However, he just wanted to live quietly as a background character, so it was all perfectly fine for him. With that, the mages at the stage conclude the magic power measurement for all students and orders them to proceed to their assigned classes. Alphonse happily strolls to his class, already looking forward to going to live a nice ordinary life in Class C. But his joy is short-lived as his name is broadcasted over a public announcement system, telling him to come to the staff room immediately. Alphonse flinches in fear. Instantly more whispers are heard all around him, wondering what Alphonse had done to get called out right away. But some also comment that it was only expected of a trash marquise's son. Alphonse himself sweats nervously. He just wanted to stay under the radar, but now everyone was staring at him. He heads on over to the staff room as ordered to. However, as soon as he opens the door, he's immediately greeted by a familiar, energetic woman. Alphonse exclaims in surprise to see Professor Roselia. He asks what she was doing in the academy, and Roselia happily tells him that the Marquis had recommended a position for her there. Apparently, Alphonse's father was so overwhelmingly grateful that Alphonse had changed from being a dumb, gross pig son that he pulled some strings with the academy. Going back to the topic at hand, Alphonse asks Roselia if he had done something wrong for him to be called to the staff room. Roselia tells him that he's done something very bad, much to his confusion. He ends up flinching when Roselia points out that he had kept his true ability secret during the magic power measurement. She asks him why he hid his strength, especially since she knew he had even more magic than Zeke. Alphonse frowns as he tries to think about an excuse. He obviously couldn't say he wanted to stay as far away as possible from the main cast. Instead, he tells Roselia that he thought Class A would be tiring to join, which does not make things sound any better, bro. Roselia exclaims in disbelief at his words. Unaware of how bad his explanation is, Alphonse keeps going and says that since Class A had all those special lessons and extra things going on for them, not to mention noble ladies might come up to talk to him, he thought it would be nothing but a hassle. Roselia goes quiet, her expression unreadable. Alphonse is left to wonder if he disappointed her. But he knew he had no choice since he had to survive. Roselia speaks up in a low voice, saying that ever since she left the Valier estate she had made a vow that she would let the world know of Alphonse's talent. Alphonse is speechless and confused. Suddenly, Roselia explodes in fiery passion as she says that Alphonse's talents belonged not just in Class A or Class S, and maybe even a Class SS could not contain it. She grabs Alphonse by the shoulders and says that those with talent had a duty to use their power, and a teacher's duty was to nurture the talents of their students. Finally, she says that she had already spoken with the headmaster to have him placed in Class A. Alphonse tries to argue with her decision, but Roselia refuses. She wouldn't accept a single objection, counter-argument, or complaint because she was his teacher. Good on her as a teacher, but also very not good for Alphonse as a character. Just like that, Alphonse could internally cry as he ended up in Class A.